Okay, so we're talking today about Iran after World War One and hopefully covering all the way up to World War Two. So we begin with the British rule in the Middle East, which is pretty much set up in the League of Nations, the system of mandates. The system of mandates is that Britain and France receive themselves a right to rule any country, quote, as they see fit on the system of mandates. So from here comes the mandate of Palestine, where they rule up until 1948. And then they equally take over what will become Iraq, and then they control these sheikhs in the Saudi Arabia, and they will create Saudi Arabian protectorate, and together with Americans, pretty much all oil. Now, same kind of thing goes in Iran, except it's actually called Persia, except there's a Shah there, and the dynasty is still there. The Qajar dynasty is still there, and the Shah is still there. So what happens in 1919? They decide to create a protectorate, and they sign a British-Persian treaty. But it ain't so easy because the Mehlis and the public opinion is absolutely dead set against this protectorate, and there's a revival of kind of constitutionalism and resistance to the British takeover. And it is in this atmosphere of kind of chaos and British domination and weak dynasty and weak Shah that you have a spectacular meteoric rise of a person who is going to become the next Shah, and his name is Reza Khan. So a few words about Reza Khan and his spectacular rise to power. He was from extremely poor village in the north somewhere, not of any noble origin, not so. Some actually say he was barely literate. But he makes his career, and there's a wonderful photograph of him in the 1890s in a Cossack uniform. And it looks just like Georgian, a little more. Yeah, something like that. So Reza Khan is a Cossack, and the only military detachments that up until World War One guard actually the Shah, they are Russian Cossacks, and they speak Russian in his unit. And he's grown up in that tradition of Cossack military discipline. And after World War One, the Cossack regiments are the only ones that actually preserve the military order. And since they are in the unit that is guarding the Shah, they are very close to power. And basically, what Reza Shah does with his unit in 1921 is what is referred to as a coup d'état, but not exactly a coup d'état because it did not overthrow the Shah. But it basically, he takes power for himself in the name of the Shah, but not also exactly because it's only military power. And in fact, the parliament works, and it's all in the guise of preserving national independence from the British. So it shouldn't be seen at this moment as a kind of a dictatorship. Not at all. It's actually quite extensive program of modernization and secularization, which begins. And there's so many things that just you take it for granted that are not there. For example, we take it for granted that people have names, the first name and the last name. Well, they didn't have any in Iran. They didn't have any registry of names or marriages or property, who owns what kind of land. I mean, none of that existed. So they're beginning to create sort of semblance of modern government with sort of a straight structures. And actually, this is when he himself chooses the name that he didn't have any last name, but he had to choose one, and he chooses it Pahlavi, which is the name of the province or the village where his father was from. So he becomes Reza Khan Pahlavi, and then Reza Shah, and these versions. In other words, the official policy of this last years of the old dynasty Qajar Shah is modernization, anti-clericalism, and nationalism, reforms in taxation, the equality of religions, and so forth. But all of that is pretty much an introduction until 1925. In 1925, there is a real coup d'etat or change of real significant change, which is basically this is when the old dynasty is overthrown. And Reza Khan has a choice. He can either become like the person he admires, Atatürk, and become a president, or he can become a new Shah. And he decides for the latter. He decides that he wants to follow the model of being a monarch. And actually, they create all kinds of things. He's crowned as a Shah. Now, the reason that is important, this is going to be, his son is going to be the Shah that will be overthrown. And it already, Reza Khan creates a kind of a symbolism of the new dynasty, which is not Islamic. And that is extremely important. He goes on to the pre-Islamic age for inspiration for the hundreds of years that Iran was a great power in Asia before Islam. I don't know what made him choose. He was obviously not very religious, this kind of identity. But if you look at the photographs and the regalia of his court and the crown and all of that, it really is not has much anything to do with Islamic heritage. So basically, the person that he tries to emulate, and he actually admires personally very much, is Atatürk of Turkey. And the best way to understand what is happening in Iran, well, let's call it what it was, Persia in the 1920s and 30s, is state-sponsored modernization, westernization, secularization, and the models we can think of is pretty much two, Atatürk and Stalin. Now, Stalin, in terms of dictatorial approach, actually Atatürk too, but Atatürk is closer because it's like Middle East, it's a neighboring country, and he goes pretty much in tandem with the kinds of things that Atatürk is doing. So he's creating modern non-clerical judiciary from scratch. There was no judiciary, there were these courts that were religiously based and community based. Educational reform on the French model. European dress is obligatory by men by 1929. Women also are prohibited to wear a veil. Universal tax is introduced. One of the greatest achievements was construction of a railroad, and that took quite some time. It was finished in the 1930s. But the interesting thing about the railroad is that the British wanted it to go east to west, which would help them in this informal control of all of Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and all the way to Afghanistan and India. But there was a strong anti-British feeling in the Mejlis and in the public at large. So the railroad that they chose to build was a north to south, which basically connected the Caspian Sea to the Gulf, to the Gulf in the Indian Ocean, and that turned out to be extraordinarily important, not only for Iran, but as a matter of fact for the outcome of World War II. Just stepping a little bit ahead, this road was used to supply the Soviet Union with American military and other supplies, Lend-Lease, during World War II, which actually contributed in big time to Red Army's effort against Hitler. So he's also building factories, and that is more like the Stalin approach, which is basically it's all government-based, totally government-based. We need a steel factory, we need a cement factory, and out of the blue, just they begin to build roads and factories. Now the British, of course, were not particularly interested in that kind of infrastructure, but they are interested in oil fields development, which goes on at the same time. The wages are low, like in the Soviet Union. There are no strikes. The banks are controlled by the British Imperial Bank. 99% of peasants are landless, illiterate, exploited, and the reforms do not go very far into the countryside. This will remain the Reza Khan's greatest weakness and also his son's greatest weakness. The countryside in Iran remained pretty undeveloped and underdeveloped, and it was all the focus was on the development of the cities and industry. It's very much kind of Stalinist approach, state-sponsored industrialization, focus on the cities, and that would be an Achilles heel of his son's, the Shah of Iran in the 1950s and 60s, because it was in the countryside where the Islamic fundamentalists or resistance to modernization would be organized and sustained. Reforms were not in any way slowed down or promoted by his being a Shah instead of a president. I don't think it makes any difference. If Atatürk decided to be a king, he would have been a king, and that would have been, there'd be absolutely no difference. Not at this point, it doesn't matter. The reason it would become important later on is with his son, Mohammad Reza, who was deliberately anti-religious. And you can be deliberately anti-religious whether you are president or general secretary of the Communist Party or an emperor. It doesn't matter. If you have religious opposition, if you suppress it, in which capacity you do it, I don't think it matters that much. Okay, so in 1935-36, women were ordered to unveil and use Western clothes. In oil fields, there are more and more workers, and the British policy is pretty much trying to control Iran in informal ways. And of course, they're very worried about trends in Iran because it's sort of any show of independence they perceive as a challenge to their authority. And of course, I already mentioned the Anglo-Iranian oil companies pumping oil and pays nothing to the Iranians, which would be big time explosion in 1953 when they would try to nationalize those oil fields. The state policy is to do everything one can to weaken the clergy, to weaken the ulema, because the ulema is so traditional and is so conservative that is actually a conflict between modernization and the conservative religious community. It's the same thing in Turkey. It's no different. It's just that in Turkey, Atatürk succeeded more in rooting out what they would call the kind of conservative reactionary clergy class than was the case in Iran. Another reason you have a difference between Iran and Persia and Turkey is that in Iran you have much more of a Russian and then Soviet influence than you have in Turkey. Because Russia and Turkey were traditionally enemies and rivals, enemies, whatever. That's not the case in Iran. In Iran, the Russians were actually looked upon more favorably than the British, and the British were much more afraid of Russian Soviet influence in the old times because of the Cossacks regiments and the kind of demarcation between the two empires. And in the 1920s and 30s, they were really scared of the Soviets because the official Soviet policy was to promote revolution. And what set it off was a very famous Congress of Oppressed Peoples of the Orient that took place in Moscow in 1920, where Lenin unveiled the policy of raising revolution against Western imperialism in the Orient, which is actually in India, China, and the Middle East. And so Iran is like very close to the Russian and Soviet empires, right across the Caspian Sea. So it's actually a point of direct contact between the British sphere of influence, if you want. In the Central Asia, you have the mountains and these wild tribes of Afghanistan. In India, there's no connection at all. China, where it borders on Russia, is like uninhabited or little inhabited wasteland of deserts and mountains and things. In Iran, the two come close. Moreover, Azerbaijan, is officially a part of Iran and a part of the Soviet Union. And that is where you have a lot of industry, and that means a lot of workers, and that means the Communist Party begins to its building up its influence. Speaking of Soviet Stalin policy, it's pretty much to like official policies to undermine British imperialism and to help the communists and to help modernization, and anything that limits British imperialism is good. So, in a sense, the British do have a valid fear of Russian Soviet influence in the north. Okay. Now, officially, the British are beginning to scheme and plot against Reza Khan because the reason that officially given in British histories on the subject is that he's starting to play up to the Germans and create, friendly relations with Germany. This is already Nazi Germany, and that is why he's overthrown and exiled. And yeah, that sort of looks like a valid explanation, but there are a few problems with that. It seems like the British and the French got into a habit of overthrowing the rulers of countries they think is in their sphere of interest and exiling them, which is the same thing happened in Morocco. When Mohammed V didn't do what he was supposed to do, they just kind of put him on the airplane and exiled him. So in a sense, I'm more inclined to think that Reza Khan was not removed because of his pro-German sympathies, that was more of an excuse. But he was pretty much building up an industrial state that could stand up to the British. And what they were particularly worried about, of course, is the oil fields. That was not the case in Morocco. There were no oil fields. And the French still removed anybody who would not do what they ordered the Moroccans to do. So that's the point. He was exiled, he was overthrown, and he ended up his life in Johannesburg in South Africa. But here's the very interesting thing. If he had been a president, then he's gone and that's it. But the Constitution actually say very explicitly that if he is incapable to rule, the power goes to his son and to his male successor, and Mohammed Reza is around. So even though they overthrew him and they brought back the Qajar Shah from Nice and put him in power, and in fact it was a pretty much British occupation of Iran, that still is important because when the war is over, Reza Khan's son claimed his power by constitution, and he did come back and did take over power. Now, one more time, the overthrow of Reza Khan is the British job, but they invited the Soviets to do it, and Stalin, of course, used his chance quite well. And this is interesting, if you could compare the British occupation and the Russian occupation. It's very, very interesting in terms of what the West and the Soviets are trying to do in the Middle East. What Stalin tried to do is to build up industry in Azerbaijan and build up a communist party for the future as a kind of a social infrastructure of revolution that would have social support. And then land reform and education. In other words, you win the hearts of people by industrialization. What the British are doing is one thing only: they're interested in money and oil, and pump up the oil and put a dictator in place who's going to guarantee the flow of oil. It's very cynical kind of colonial exploitation of Iran. The reason I mention this, and I'm finishing, is that the Iranians remembered all this. There's tremendous hostility to the present day of the British and then the Americans who replaced them, especially since it was pretty much clear robbery of pumping out oil without compensation, overthrowing their legitimate ruler elected by the Mehlis, putting their own ones, essentially treating a country with centuries of noble tradition of independence as if they are kind of a toy to be disposed. And that is what they were doing pretty much in China too, and in India, and in Palestine, and in Egypt. And they earned the wrath of these people that's going to hit them back after World War II.